Thank you, Antonio. Thank you for your introduction. And good morning to you. Thank you very much for coming. And thank you to all the organisers for inviting me to this remarkable festival. By placing this lecture on a Sunday morning, the organisers have given you the choice of attending Mass or attending a lecture on Voltaire, and Voltaire would have approved of that choice. Thank you. Voltaire lived a long life and wrote an enormous amount, but he's remembered above all for one short novel, Candide. This is, in all senses of the term, a classic. One definition of a classic might be that it is a work which everyone has read. Another definition, not entirely incompatible, is that a classic is a work which everyone knows and which they think they have read, a work which is so familiar that we can't remember if we've read it or not. So my aim here is to try to remind you of what you already know about Candide and to try to persuade you to read it again. Candide was a bestseller from the moment it was published 250 years ago in 1759. But to say that Candide enjoyed an immediate success is an understatement. Candide was a phenomenon, a bestseller all over Europe, and more than that, it was what we would now call a media event. The novel was published through the medium of print, but we shouldn't take that for granted. The print world of the 18th century posed two particular challenges. The first was censorship. England enjoyed a fairly free press, but most European countries had systems for controlling the output of publishers. In France, for example, a book might be censored by the king, by judges, or by the Catholic Church, or by any combination of those three. The second challenge was piracy. The notion of copyright in a printed work was a relatively new idea in the 18th century, and in most countries, once a book was published, it was considered to be in the public domain, liable to be copied or pirated. Voltaire knew that Candide was liable to be censored, and he knew too that it was likely to be pirated. But he turned these apparent disadvantages into huge advantages. The first edition of Candide was printed early in 1759 by Voltaire's regular printer in this period, Cronk, in Geneva. But to speak of a first printing is misleading. Before handing over a final manuscript to Cronk, Voltaire went behind Cronk's back and sent a slightly different version of the manuscript to John Nourse, a printer in London. He may have dispatched other copies to other publishers, and the result was that within weeks of the first edition of Candide appearing in Geneva, other editions appeared in London, in Paris, and Amsterdam. There was an enormous buzz surrounding the new work. It was not signed by Voltaire, a fact which of course only confirmed that he must have written it, and numerous pirated editions soon flooded the market, all across Europe, to meet the pressing demand of readers to have the new work, and Voltaire's genius was to know how to fuel expectation and to create the demand for this writing. Before the year 1759 was over, there had appeared no fewer than 17 different French editions of Candide. The publishing history is so complicated that even today, only 2 libraries in the world own all of these precious editions, one in Oxford and the other in New York. Translations are further evidence of the Candide craze. The first translation into Italian appeared immediately in 1759, only months after the first appearance of the French work. Voltaire was popular in England too, and in the course of that first year, 59, no fewer than 3 different English translations were published in London. Of course, the censors tried to halt the progress of the work, and of course they failed. The more they criticised the work, the more it sold. And the more it sold, the more pirated editions were produced. The censors and the pirate publishers, often seen as the author's enemies, all contributed hugely to the success of Candide. Part of Voltaire's genius lay in his understanding of the medium of print and his ability to manipulate the book market for his own ends. If he had lived today, we can imagine his career as a spin doctor, working in the modern media of television or Twitter. It's the sure sign of a classic that it leaves a permanent imprint on the language. Voltaire's Candide is no exception. We all of us, to some extent, find ourselves speaking Candide. If this is the best of all possible worlds, what are others? Asks Candide in chapter 6. And the expression best of all possible worlds comes originally from the philosopher Leibniz, but it's Voltaire's repeated use of the words in Candide that makes them familiar to us today. Many more of us have read Candide than have read Leibniz. Another well-known phrase occurs in the final chapter. When the characters come together at the end, all argument is silenced with the words, "We must cultivate the garden." What exactly this means is not clear, but all of us know the words. One saying from Candide was an instant hit with early readers. In chapter 16, Candide and his servant Cacambo, travelling in the New World, dressed as Jesuits, fall into the hands of cannibals who exclaim triumphantly, "Mangeons du Jésuite, let's eat some Jesuit." The cry was enthusiastically taken up by contemporaries, and it became a catchphrase in French. The Jesuits were not popular in France at this time. They were to be expelled from France in 1764. And Voltaire coined a phrase which became proverbial because he caught the mood of the moment. Voltaire was always attuned to contemporary events that struck a chord with his readers. In 1756, there had been a naval battle between the British and the French, off the coast of Minorca. The battle had no clear outcome, but the English Admiral John Byng was thought to have been insufficiently courageous, and he was sentenced to be executed. Candide is shocked that the British were shooting someone on their own side, and he receives this explanation. I quote, "In this country, it is good to kill an admiral from time to time to give courage to the others." In French, pour encourager les autres. This last French phrase has, although it's not used in French, has become proverbial in modern English. So even when we speak English, we find ourselves speaking Candide. Candide is a timeless work, a satire of the human condition. It's also a work of the Enlightenment, and its philosophical theme is announced in the full title of the work, Candide, or Optimism. The hero of Candide, as his name tells us, is an innocent, an anti-hero. He's enthralled to his tutor Pangloss, who preaches the philosophy of optimism. This is not quite optimism in the modern sense of looking on the bright side. This is optimism spelled with a capital O, expounded by the German philosopher Leibniz. And it was an attempt to answer the age-old problem of evil. Why, if God is good, does he permit the existence of evil in the world? To which the 18th century... In Candide, then, Voltaire thinks about the problem of evil. Why, if God is good, does he permit the existence of evil in the world? To which the 18th century optimist replies, evil is part of some greater pattern of good. And I quote, all partial evil, universal good, as the English poet Pope put it. In other words, according to this theory, evil doesn't really exist. It's just something which man imagines because of his limited view of the world. You might think this sounds like a bit of a confidence trick. Voltaire certainly did, but the idea found widespread acceptance in the 18th century. Pangloss, his name means that he speaks all tongues, is of course the spokesman for optimism in the novel. Here is Pangloss in action. I quote from chapter 1.
È provato, diceva Pangloss, che le cose non potrebbero stare altrimenti. Essendo tutto quanto creato in vista di un fine, tutto è necessariamente inteso al fine migliore. I nasi, notate, sono fatti per reggere gli occhiali, e noi infatti abbiamo gli occhiali. Le gambe non è inedita come siano istituite per essere calzate, e noi abbiamo appunto i pantaloni. Lo scopo delle pietre è di essere tagliate e murate in castello. Sua Grazia Barone possiede precisamente un bellissimo castello. Il maggior barone della provincia ha da essere meglio alloggiato, e i porci, essendo creati perché si mangiano, noi mangiamo porco tutto l'anno. Ne consegue che coloro i quali hanno affermato che tutto va bene hanno detto una castroneria. Bisognava dire che meglio di così non potrebbe andare.
Well, as an example of logical thinking, it's hard to know how to make sense of this. The argument that you have just heard is sometimes called the argument from final causes, or the argument from design. The idea is that the design of the universe makes it clear that there has to be a divine designer. Or, to use the example that Voltaire likes, the design and architecture of the watch means that there must be a watchmaker. God is the great watchmaker in the sky. The argument from design was especially popular in the 18th century. But even nowadays, we hear arguments which are not so different. Intelligent design is a phrase we hear a lot, especially in the United States. In the passage just quoted, Voltaire is making fun of the argument from design, of course. But we need to look at the argument more closely. To say I quote, "the nose has been formed to bear spectacles," is funny because the upside-down Alice in Wonderland logic. But what Voltaire also shows is how man pretends to argue a general and disinterested point, while in fact arguing from his own personal position. Look at the choice of examples here: spectacles, stockings, stones for building a castle, and roast pork. This is the portrait of the Baron sitting down to dinner. His mental universe extends no further than his physical domain, and both are rather limited. No philosophical example is ever innocent, and the giveaway here is pigs were made to be eaten. The pork-eating German Baron, wearing his spectacles and his stockings, sitting in his castle, doesn't seem to know about Jews or Muslims. Why didn't God design the world for them too? The argument from design is meant to prove the existence of God, and in fact, in this example, it merely proves the existence of German barons. Candide puts this philosophy of optimism to the test. Ejected from his comfortable home in an obscure castle after trying to seduce the baron's beautiful daughter Cunégonde, he undergoes many trials. Conscripted into the army, he fights a war and then deserts, and is then witness to the Lisbon earthquake, a real event of 1755 which killed some 40,000 people. Candide is repeatedly brought face to face with evil in its most extreme forms. Moral evil, in the case of the earthquake, where man is not to blame, and most of all, human evil, such as the war, where man is very much to blame. It's important to remember that Candide was written in the middle of the 7 Years' War, which had begun in 1756. Voltaire's bitter depiction of war is a direct response to the contemporary horrors then taking place in Germany. Pangloss's breezy optimism, as you just heard, is a totally inadequate response to enormities on this scale. Eventually, even Candide comes to realize this. The turning point is a chance encounter with a Negro slave as Candide and his servant approach the town of Suriname. And here is a quotation from chapter 19.
Buon Dio, nella vicinanza della città videro giacere in terra un negro, il quale non aveva più che una metà del suo vestito, un paio cioè di mutande del trachine. Il pover'uomo era privo inoltre della mano destra e del piede mancino. Buon Dio, fece Candido nell'olandese, che fate qui, amico, in questo stato orribile? Aspetto il mio padrone, l'illustre mercante signor Vanderemoli, forse è stato il signor Vanderemoli a conciarti in questa maniera? Sì, signore, da noi si usa così. 2 volte l'anno ci passa un paio di mutande, il nostro unico vestito. Quando lavoriamo nel mulino a zucchero e la macchina ci sta col mito, ci tagliano la mano. Quando diventiamo di fuggire, ci separano la gamba. A me sono capitati entrambi i casi. Questo è il costo dello zucchero che mangiate in Roma.
Candide is moved to tears by this sight, and he utters the word optimism, which he has to explain to his servant Cacambo. This is the first and only time that the word optimism is actually spoken in the novel. And once the term has been uttered, the idea is discredited once and for all. Here's another extract from chapter 19.
Oh Pangloss, esclamò Candido, questa abominazione tu non l'avevi prevista. Non c'è rimedio, bisognerà per forza che io rinneghi il tuo ottimismo. Ottimismo? Che vuol dire? Domandò Cacambo. Ahimè, che la smania di pretendere che tutto va bene quando stiamo guardando quel negro, a Candido vennero le lacrime negli occhi e fece il suo ingresso in Suriname piangendo.
More adventures ensue. Candide and Cacambo return to Europe, an excuse for a satirical portrait of Paris and then of Venice, and eventually all the various protagonists meet up, utterly implausibly, in Constantinople. The characters find a resolution of sorts, or do they, in the final chapter, and finally we get to the punchline that we've been waiting for the whole novel. Here is the last paragraph of the last chapter, chapter 30.
Pangloss, di volta in volta, diceva Candido, in questo migliore dei mondi possibili, tutti i fatti sono connessi tra loro. Tanto è vero che se voi non fosse stato scacciato a Cancalcin a sedere da quel castello per amore di Vangelo con Cronk, se voi non foste capitati sotto l'Inquisizione, se non aveste corso l'America a piedi, se non aveste infilzato un barone, se non aveste perso tutte le pecore nel bel paese del Dorado, ecco che voi non sareste qui a mangiare cieli canditi e pescati. Vedete bene, rispondeva Candido, ma bisogna che coltiviamo il nostro giardino.
How exactly are we to understand this? The traditional way of reading the novel is to say that Voltaire is attacking Leibnizian optimism by making fun of it. In the first half of the novel, the emphasis is on discrediting Pangloss, who stands, as we have seen, for Leibniz. Then in the second half, following the utopia of El Dorado, Martin, another character, appears with an alternative solution, that of Manichaeism, the idea that the world is divided into two equal powers of good and evil. Martin is discredited in his turn, and finally we come to the conclusion where Candide learns not to trust philosophers, to keep his head down, and to cultivate his garden. This traditional reading is in many ways inadequate, and there are many ways of arguing against it. To make an obvious point, few of us now know much or anything about Leibniz, but we continue to find Candide very funny. Candide has lasted much longer than Leibniz's Theodicy, and it continues to speak to us. Why is that? Does it talk about more than just Leibniz? Another problem with the traditional reading is that it's too uninteresting and too reductive. It reduces Voltaire's complex work to a simple set of arguments. And it takes no account of the central fact, which is that Candide is a novel. It's not a philosophical treatise, it's a piece of fiction. And if we read any novel as a philosophical treatise, we run the risk of finding it not interesting. But if we read Candide as it should be read, as a sophisticated interplay of language, of plot, and of character, if we think about the characters and about how the readers respond to them, we find a work which is much more complex. The problem of evil, as traditionally presented, seems remote and theoretical, and yet the book is funny and immediate. This is because the philosophical dilemma at the heart of the novel is freedom, and this speaks to us much more directly. Evil is about determinism. Are we free or are we not free to determine our own actions? And if not, in what sense can we be responsible for our evil actions? Historians of ideas like to make a contrast between the 17th century, which is said to be pessimistic, and the 18th century, which is said to be optimistic. And according to this view, the 17th century remains wedded to a Christian view of man and an essentially pessimistic view of his abilities to control his own destiny. While the 18th century is the century of enlightenment, of reason, when Christian values are questioned and a more optimistic view of human nature prevails. In this simple opposition, Voltaire, of course, is on the side of the moderns. But if we focus on human freedom as the central issue, this opposition disappears. Let us think about the idea of fate, the notion that what will be will be. This idea has many names in different philosophical systems: fate, destiny, predestination, determinism. In all these variants, there is the same basic notion that man is not entirely responsible for what happens to him. His free will is limited. In France, in the 17th century, the Catholic Church knew this debate, and the Jesuits defended free will, while another group, the Jansenists, defended predestination, a form of religious fatalism. According to their view, man was doomed to obey the will of God. Voltaire detests this view. Their most powerful spokesman was Pascal, and Voltaire, all through his life, opposed the particular Christianity of Pascal. On the other hand, in France, in Voltaire's lifetime, there was an increasing movement to talk about atheism, and Voltaire was not an atheist. Although this view was rare in his youth, ideas of atheism became more strident and more confident, especially later in the century after 1770. You would expect atheists like La Métrie or D'Holbach to defend a view opposite to Pascal's. But paradoxically, this is not the case. 18th century atheism advocates a sort of materialistic fatalism. Events are determined, not by the divine will, but by the relentless sequence of cause and effect, the chain of events. Man was doomed to obey the immutable laws of nature. So, by a strange paradox, the follower of Pascal and the follower of La Métrie, the Christian and the anti-Christian, both end up with the same view, albeit for different reasons. Man is not in charge of his own destiny. Voltaire is opposed to both forms of fatalism, and as best he can, he defends free will, and he defends the notion that man is, at least to some extent, in charge of his actions and in control of his fate. So I would like to suggest, therefore, that we reread Candide not as a book about evil, but as a book about fortuna, a book about luck and destiny. Pangloss defends the Leibnizian view that evil does not really exist, and he defends it regardless of circumstances. He has no freedom at all, it seems, to think for himself, and his predetermined mechanistic responses become comic. Exactly the same is true of Martin. The two men defend opposing viewpoints, but it comes to the same thing in the end, and each cancels the other out, because neither is free to think. They're conditioned like puppets, their responses are automated, and we laugh at their movements, their reactions, without really stopping to think about the ideas which they spout. Candide, as the central character, is interesting in this respect. It's often said of him that he's not a three-dimensional person, merely a puppet. And it's certainly true that the aesthetic of Voltaire's novel is not that of the novelists of the 19th century, where fully rounded characters draw the reader into their worlds. But even so, Candide is more complex than just a puppet. Faced by evil of every sort, he keeps moving, and he keeps asking questions. He tries to assert his freedom, even when his room for choice is limited. And we quoted earlier the scene in the novel when Candide comes face to face with the Negro slave, and for the first time in the novel, he weeps. In shedding tears, Candide reclaims just a small amount of liberty. He asserts his humanity against the forces which otherwise seem overwhelming. The novel presents Candide as a character torn between determinism and free will. Candide does not feel fully free, but that does not stop him striving, and that does not deny that he has at least some limited freedom. In the final chapter, called, perhaps misleadingly, Conclusion, Candide learns the wisdom of a sort in cultivating the garden. But I think it would be a mistake to understand this as resignation, as it is usually read. The real conclusion of Candide is one of optimism. Not optimism in the Leibnizian sense, but optimism in the modern sense. Despite overwhelming difficulties, a man must keep moving. Man must keep questioning and exercise whatever freedom there is, because, Voltaire seems to say, that is all we have. The reader of Candide cannot remain uninvolved. He's obliged to ask questions. For all the comedy, the hero of Candide is a character in search of truth, and in that sense, the work is a product of the Enlightenment. The 18th century liked to see itself as shedding light on the darkness of traditions and beliefs. The image of light is a key one. Italians speak of illumi, the French of les lumières, the Germans of Aufklärung, and the name most often given to this light is, I suppose, reason. The 18th century is called by supporters as well as detractors the age of reason. But if the Enlightenment can't be reduced to one single philosophy, it can perhaps be summed up by an attitude, by an approach to establishing truth. And put simply, the Enlightenment stresses human reason over blind faith. It advocates the experimental method, and it places common sense over revealed truth. In championing human reason over faith, the Enlightenment marks a turning point in the Western philosophical tradition. For the philosopher Kant, what defined the Enlightenment was having the courage to make up one's own mind and not accept the truth from others. And I quote Kant, "Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed maturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lies not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve, and courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude, dare to know, have courage to use your own understanding," says Kant. That is the motto of Enlightenment. Which brings us back to the definition of Enlightenment. Many of the central ideas of Enlightenment, like the belief in experimental method, have their roots in the previous century, in thinkers like Galileo. What the Enlightenment does is to develop and popularize these ideas, to give them wider currency, and making them accessible to a wholly new audience. Voltaire's genius lies in knowing how to use the medium of print so as to have an impact on public opinion. "I write in order to act," he told one of his friends. And of course Voltaire has the impact on public opinion that he has because he amuses his readers at the same time as he challenges them. Let's look at another episode in Candide. Our hero is travelling with his servant in the New World when they come across a strange sight. Here is an incident from chapter 16.
Il sole era altalento. A un tratto, in questo periodo si udirono dei piccoli gridi che parevano donne. Non capivano se fossero voci di dolore o di piacere. Pieni di quell'inquietudine, tuttavia, e del sospetto che un paese sconosciuto nascono da ogni cosa, alzarono in piedi il precipizio. Chi mandava quelle voci erano due ragazze, molte come Dio le aveva fatte, le quali correvano leggere al margine della prateria, incalzate da due scimmioni che mordevano loro le maniche. Tanto si prese la compassione. I bulgari gli avevano insegnato anche a tirare, avrebbe colto una nocciola sul ramo senza toccare le foglie. Diede di figlio sullo schiotto spagnolo ai giocannoli, tirò e freddò i cuscinetti.
This charitable act, as Candide thinks, turns out to have catastrophic consequences. The two women are distraught with grief, and the servant Cacambo has to explain to the incredulous Candide that he has just shot the two girls' lovers.
Caro padrone, io fate gran meraviglia della Venezia. E c'è quelli strano se in qualche paese di scimmoni che questa è signore. Sono pure dei quattro uomini, come io, per un fatto sono spagnolo. Ora siete persuaso e avete veduto come procede la gente senza istruzione.
Of course, Voltaire's having fun here, ironising about the benefits of education. That's a dig at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and teasing us with the erotic subject matter. There's no surprise that this scene of the lecherous monkeys biting the girls' bottoms has been a firm favourite with every illustrator of the novel. But Voltaire's also making a serious point about relativism, about the differing values of other cultures, and about the danger of judging others from a European or a Christian perspective. The grieving women denounce Candide and Cacambo to the local tribesmen, the Loberos, who are cannibals. They promptly capture the two travellers and, mistaking them for Jesuits, prepare them for dinner, crying out triumphantly, "Let's eat some Jesuit, mangeons du Jésuite." That's the phrase that became a proverb in France. Candide complains that this is a very un-Christian procedure, but Cacambo, more versed in the nuances of cultural difference, reasons with the cannibals, explaining that there has been a dreadful mistake, and that they are not in the fact Jesuits at all. The cannibals are quite fussy about their diet. They only eat Jesuit, and they're men of reason. They check their facts, and they realise their mistake, and release the two captives. This is chapter 16 again.
I Ovvero ritennero che questo discorso fosse estremamente ragionevole. Allora slegarono i prigionieri, li onorarono in una maniera, addirittura gestirono le ragazze, dettero loro come un fresco. E per tanto non riusciva a liberarsi di questa situazione.
The joke here, of course, is that the Liberos found Cacambo's speech, I quote, very reasonable. The cannibals do not share the same sexual mores as the Europeans. That's Candide's first surprise. But, and this is his second surprise, they do absolutely share the European sense of reason. Reason is a universal, Voltaire seems to be saying, even if sexual mores are not. And by juxtaposing the New World and the Old, Voltaire is testing out the ways in which Europeans judge and prejudge. There are many different Enlightenment voices at work in Candide. And in keeping with Kant's motto, dare to know, Voltaire dares to ask. 250 years later, Voltaire's Candide continues to make us ask questions. Readers are challenged to ask questions of a philosophical nature. They are also challenged to ask questions of a fictional nature, even in the process of reading the novel. For among other things, this novel is a sort of encyclopedia of the novel. It's filled with allusions, parodies, pastiches, references to novels of every possible kind. Candide wonders if he is free. But what about the reader? Is the reader free? Let's take a final example from the opening lines of the book. This is the first paragraph of chapter 1.
C'era in Westfalia, castello del signor Domenica, come il Cronk, un ragazzo cui la natura aveva fornito un temperamento assai libero. Si dirigeva in fronte di un signore, aveva un intelletto abbastanza solido e un ingenuo cuore del mondo. Credo che fosse chiamato Candido appunto per questo. Gli altri servitori di casa sospetavano che egli fosse il figlio della sorella del signor Barone e di un uomo rispettabile e cavaliere avvicinato. Non aveva mai tenuto di sposare con la moglie perché non era riuscito a trovare che 72 suoi quarti di nobiltà, essendo spinto e eminenti sorte generosi nella parte del tempo, fossero sufficienti.
So as you heard, the story begins like a fairy tale, once upon a time. But the mood does not last long. And in fact, it's already soured by the end of the paragraph, with the ironic references to the snobbishness of the Baron's sister. And nothing is quite what it seems. We think, as readers, that we are free to read how we want, but we're not. First of all, we think we're in a fairy tale, but then the tone turns sour and we're not so sure. Are we free to read this as a fairy tale or not? Then we get to the story of Candido's birth, and this is very disturbing. To any novel reader in the mid-18th century, this was a completely familiar story. It is exactly the story of the birth of the hero in Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, the hugely successful English novel which came out just a few years before Candide. So what is going on? Why is Voltaire rewriting Fielding? Is the reader free to read how he wishes, or are we determined to read through the filter of Tom Jones? And the single oddest word in the paragraph you just heard is I. Who is this pronoun I that says I apprehend, je crois, in the French original? Presumably there's some sort of narrator who is telling the tale. And for a moment we do seem to be in a conventional fairy tale, where the narrator takes us by the hand and leads us reassuringly through the events. Fair enough, except that this one appearance of he or she disappears. The narrator leaves us on our own after this brief and apparently pointless appearance. We're not, after all, to be guided through the story. The narrator makes a brief appearance and then disappears. He's let us down by stealing any old plot from Tom Jones. Nothing is quite as it seems. We're left on our own, left to make sense as best we can. Just like Candide in the world. We as readers are free and not free. Free to read as we wish, but not free to ignore the intertexts and allusions that guide our responses, sometimes despite ourselves. At the end of chapter 1, Candide, after making love to Cunégonde, is ejected from the chateau by the Baron. Of course, this is God ejecting Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden after the fall, except that in Voltaire's rewriting, Adam leaves Eve behind. It's bad enough that Voltaire borrows the plot from Tom Jones, but when in the same chapter he borrows also the story of the book of Genesis and mixes the two together, we as readers begin to be seriously confused. What sort of fictional world is this, where modern English comic fiction is indistinguishable from Holy Scripture? And so, rather to our surprise perhaps, we end up like Candide, finding ourselves in a world where luck and destiny sometimes seem to limit our choices, but where nonetheless we keep moving. We assert our humanity and we assert our choices. We assert our free will whenever and wherever we can, even though it's limited. This is a novel in the true sense, by which I mean that we don't merely admire the characters from afar. In reading Candide, we as readers undergo a moral experience and feel at first hand the tensions felt by the characters. We as readers feel the tension between free will and determinism. Candide is a lesson in humanity and a lesson in reading. We are impressed by the need to keep moving, to keep questioning, never to give up. Our freedom, such as it is, resides in questioning and in rejecting dogmatism. And also in laughing. I've been taking for granted the single most striking feature of the novel, its comedy. But remember that the laughter of Candide is subversive. This is a novel about freedom, and reading Candide makes us as readers free. Thank you.